Hey everyone, I'm Katie Hayes. Thanks for joining in. Today we are going to talk about yoga blocks. I'm a huge fan of yoga blocks and I think they're really important to learn how to use in your practice. I practice with a yoga block basically every single time I hit my mat. I think yogis, and not just beginner yogis, yogis in general, have a block about using blocks. Somehow they have decided that using a block means that they're not a good yogi, or they're not good at yoga. And it's simply not true. Using a block to help you get into a pose in proper alignment is much more important than getting into a pose more deeply, but having your body all misaligned. So I'm going to show you why and how. Before we get into how to integrate blocks into some common yoga poses, let's actually talk about blocks. So here are two different examples of material that blocks are typically made in. So this is cork. There's a little weight to it, so to me they feel more sturdy, especially when I'm in poses where I'm putting my weight on the block, and you'll see what I mean shortly. And then these are foam blocks, and they basically weigh nothing. So for certain things that we do in yoga, sometimes I prefer using a foam block, especially if you're moving it around. It's a little lighter. Everybody has their own preference, so you'll just have to kind of experiment and see what you like. Yoga blocks are pretty standard. So they're typically all 8 inches by 6 inches. The thickness can be a little bit different depending on the studio that you're going to. This is a 4-inch thick block. You may also find 3-inch thick blocks. Those are typically the two thicknesses you're gonna find. What a yoga block does, essentially, is it builds the floor up to where you need it to be. And that might make a little more sense once we get into some of the poses. So because there are all these different lengths, you can use the block 4 inches, you can give yourself 6 inches, you can flip it, you can give yourself 8 inches. So it depends on what the pose is, how open you're feeling in the day, and what your body requires in that moment. All right, first pose we're going to use a yoga block in. Sukasana, easy pose. This is it. If you have tight hips, this pose may be really difficult for you to sit in comfortably. So a friend of mine has very tight hips who does yoga, and his Sukasana is more like this. And because his hips are tight and his knees are so tight he can't let them drop, he starts to lean back, and then his back starts to round. And then his Sukasana begins to turn into like this little shell. That's not what we want. Yoga is all about expanding and opening. So we always want the heart open, the chest open, everything expanding. So a simple solution is my best friend, the yoga block. We will simply slide this yoga block underneath the bum. Sit on the block, hips are higher, knees can relax down towards the floor. When you have tight hips and you're sitting on a yoga block, you're going to notice that it's easier to sit taller. It's not so much effort. You're not rounding your back so much. So we always want our spine to be stacked upon itself. We want this nice long line. So not only this way, but we also want that long straight line this way too. We don't want to be rounding. Okay, pose number 1. Next pose we're going to get into using a yoga block is low lunge or Anjaneyasana, which are kind of variations of each other. So here I am in low lunge. Now, ideally, I want my palms to be planted, but not if that means my chest starts to cave. So an option is to grab blocks, and I'm going to place them underneath the palms. Now you can change the block height to get more lift in the chest. We want that chest reaching forward, heart open. Maybe you find yourself in your low lunge and you feel pretty comfortable here, but when you go to twist, you feel a little closed down. Same thing, we're going to bring a yoga block underneath the planted hand and then twist the torso. So we're keeping the chest nice and open, heart is lifted. Anjaneyasana is another pose that we can use this yoga block in. So once you lower to your knee and you start to shift your weight forward, when we inhale, maybe we're just bringing our hands up to blocks to keep our heart open. So this is just a variation of Anjaneyasana. It's going to help you feel a little more stable, especially when you're beginning your yoga practice. So same thing here, if we're taking a twist from Anjaneyasana, we can bring that block underneath the palm that we're planting and keep the heart nice and open. So a transition that I add into a lot of my classes is moving from Anjaneyasana into half split, Ardha Hanumanasana. So if we're in full Anjaneyasana and we're going to exhale, moving into half split, you tuck the toes under, you start to shift the weight back, pulling the front toes towards the body, heart reaching forward. So right here, you may need to bring blocks underneath the shoulders to keep the heart lifted. Keep yourself rooted down so that you can fold forward with a flat back. Okay, chair pose. Especially if you're new to yoga, using a block is an awesome way in chair pose to keep the correct muscles active. So what we do is we're going to bring our feet hip distance apart. We're going to take our yoga block and squeeze it between the thighs. So we keep squeezing the block, pressing equally into both feet. Bring the hands overhead on an inhale. As you exhale, sit the booty low. We keep squeezing the block so that we're engaging our thigh muscles without actually bringing our knees together, because we want to keep everything hip distance apart. In this chair pose, hands can come to heart center, navel pulls in, squeeze everything into the midline. Now we're going to use blocks in pyramid pose. Pyramid pose we're typically coming into from warrior one. So imagine we're going through a flow and we're landing in warrior one. And the instructor is having you come into pyramid pose. Now when I teach it, I always have you step the back foot up a couple inches and then straighten the front knee. Front hip, this time it's my left, is going to keep pulling back. We're going to hinge at the waist. Release your hands underneath your shoulders, maybe to your blocks. So in pyramid pose, if you're using blocks, don't use them way out on the edges of your mat. Bring them actually underneath the shoulders so that everything is stacked correctly. So we're going to lengthen through the spine, pulling the left hip back, gaze is at the floor. And on your next exhale, flat back as far as you can, folding over, rounding down. Let the head be heavy. Once you fold over, maybe you need to readjust the height of your blocks. Okay, so two poses where we're really low to the ground that you can use your block in is hero's pose, is where you're sitting on your heels. I'm going to do it this way so you can see me. Hero's pose where you're sitting on your heels. Now, if this is uncomfortable for your knees, you can bring a block between the feet and sit on the block, so it takes some pressure off the knee. Now again, you've got different heights with your block. You can sit as tall as you need to. Another one is Malasana, which is yogi squat. So if you come into your Malasana pose, we're engaging the Mula Bandha, pulling the pelvic floor, all the energy is pulling up. Now, maybe this pose is not your favorite pose. Maybe the muscles that you use to keep yourself lifted in this pose are not as strong as you'd like them to be. You can bring the block underneath the bum. So instead of engaging all of your muscles to lift, you can focus more on the opening of the hips. Once your muscles get stronger, you can start to take the block away. All right, we're going to be moving into Dancing Warrior series. I'm going to use the block for both side angle and triangle pose. So imagine that we're going through a Dancing Warrior series. I'm in Warrior 2. And now I'm going to move into side angle pose. So you can start to shift forward, keeping the heart and pelvis open to the side. But maybe I want to progress this pose a little bit. And I'm going to take my right hand and I'm going to drop it to a block behind my, my lower leg. So when I drop it to a block, what happens is I can still keep my heart very open. Now often students don't like to use blocks, so they start to drop their hand to the floor, and what's going to happen is my heart is going to start to close. Now you might have noticed as soon as I came down, my top shoulder started to come over to the side. So I'm not open, I'm closed down. Bring the block, I can open. Okay. Other side. This time, let's say we're coming from Warrior 2. And we're going to move into triangle pose. So I'm going to start to straighten my front knee. Left fingers begin to reach forward as far as I can, and then I hinge at the hips. Left hand, I'm going to bring down to a block. Again, same concept. I'm keeping my heart open. So here, I have my shoulders stacked over each other, hips on top of hip, and everything is nice and open. If I were to drop this hand to the floor, let me just do that for you. I'm going to drop this hand all the way to the floor. My top shoulder might start to come forward, closing the heart and chest. All right, another pose that I see students coming into without the assistance of a block is half moon pose. Now, the true half moon pose, your pelvis and your heart are open to the side wall, long side of the mat. And not only is everything open in the same direction, but the leg that is lifted is creating a line. So there's going to be this straight line from my heel all the way down my leg, through my hip, down my spine, out the crown of my head. I'll show you what happens when we don't use the block. All right, so I'm gonna just pretend like I'm going through a flow. We're moving into half moon pose. I'm using my block. I'm hugging everything in. Okay, so from my heel all the way out to the crown of my head, more or less is a straight line. But what happens when I don't use a block, but I don't have the core strength to keep myself lifted or floating? Oh, what happened to my heel? Now my heel is way up in the air and the crown of my head is facing the floor. We don't want that. We want the alignment. We want the length. We want everything in its proper place. So using a block, even though you can hold yourself up, it doesn't mean that you should. We're going to move into Prasarita, standing wide leg forward fold. Now in this posture, when we start to move into it, we want to keep our back flat as we fold forward. So if the muscles in the back body are tight, I might not be able to get very far down, so I'm going to use my blocks. Again, I'm getting into all these poses just willy-nilly. You know, obviously you're moving from a flow through the poses, but I'm stepping my feet wide. Feet are parallel to the short sides of my mat. So I'm taking a nice big inhale. As I exhale, I begin to fold at the waist. Flat back going down, hands underneath the shoulders. Oh no, I'm not to the floor. I'm going to grab my blocks and bring them underneath the shoulders. So I'm lengthening through the spine. My gaze is at the mat, nice and long. So you can stay right here. If this is where you're getting your best stretch, this is where you stay. Maybe you have a little bit more openness and you're going to let the hands come down to the mat. Maybe you start to bend the elbows. So from here you can walk your hands behind you. And what else can you do with your block? You can bring it underneath the forehead, giving yourself a little bit of support. Another way to use your block is underneath the forearms in poses such as pigeon pose or lizard or wide leg seated forward fold. So I'm going to show you lizard pose, how you could use your block to be able to enhance the pose a little bit. Okay, so now imagine I came into this pose in the middle of my flow. And I want to maybe get a little bit deeper. So maybe I lower to my back knee and I decide I want to go a little bit deeper still. Now I can bring my forearms to a block. What this does for one is it takes pressure off your wrist. So if you have any wrist pain, which I obviously do, you can come down to your forearms and it'll feel a little bit better on the body. What else am I accomplishing by keeping my forearms on a block instead of bringing them all the way down to the floor? You got it. I'm keeping my heart open. So I'm keeping my heart facing the front of the room. I'm spreading my collarbones, my shoulders to the edges of the room, keeping my heart and chest as open as possible. If I bring my forearms all the way down to the mat and I'm not feeling open, what just happened to my chest? Now my chest is facing the floor. That's not where I want to be. Next pose we're going to use the block in is bridge pose. I'm going to show you two different ways to use the block. So let's just recline down to the mat and we'll start there. So to set up for our bridge pose, couple things to make sure. Back of the head is flat on the mat. So if your hair is in the way, your bun or your ponytail, you have to move it. You want to keep your gaze at the ceiling throughout the entirety of the pose. We don't want to put pressure on the shoulders and the neck and the head and then start moving our head around. It's going to compromise your neck and it's not going to feel very good. Next, we want to line up feet and knees hip distance apart. We're going to take our block. We're going to take the shortest side of the block and squeeze that block between the thighs. Arms come long by your sides. You're going to try to graze your fingertips to the back of your heels. If you can't touch the back of your heels, start to walk the feet a little bit closer. Now, they may not touch, and that's okay. You just want to get your feet as close as you can. We're gonna start to press hands and feet into the mat, squeeze our block, and then lift the pelvis as high as we can, finding our bridge pose. So these hip points, the front pointy parts of the hips, we keep pressing to the ceiling. Relax the shoulders, let the throat be open, keep squeezing that block. So we're keeping our lower half engaged. Mula bandha is engaged, my thigh muscles are engaged, my booty is engaged. That's our proper bridge pose. We can also use a block for a restorative bridge pose. So if you want a more mellow version of bridge, you can follow along with me. Just like we did before. Back of the head is flat on the mat. Gaze stays at the ceiling. Knees and feet are hip distance apart. Now if you have two blocks, you can use one between the thighs if you like the way that felt. Walk the heels back towards the body. Hands and feet begin to press into the mat. Inhale, lift the pelvis. And then we're going to take that block and slide it underneath the hips. Relax the hips back down. So notice that this block is underneath my, my hip bones, my sacrum. It's not on my spine. It's really important that the block is placed properly. Now I have it on the lowest setting. If you're feeling a little more open, you can always flip the block and get the hips a little bit higher. Now your hands can rest on your tummy. They can rest on the sides. Your gaze is at the ceiling. And you just relax into your restorative bridge pose. Last thing I'm going to do with this block today is an ab set. Now it's not a yoga pose, but as you may have begun to figure out, a lot of yoga requires core strength. The stronger your core, the more easily you will be able to move in and out of poses, the more easily you'll be able to transition. You'll be able to progress your poses more deeply if you have a strong core. So we're going to grab our yoga block. We're going to recline. Feet are going to reach to the ceiling. We're going to press, squeeze the block either between the shins or the ankles, whatever feels best for you. Inhale, hands overhead. As you exhale, begin to crunch with the torso, reaching up for that block. Switch the block. As you inhale, you're going to reach everything long. Exhale, crunch. Switch the block again. Inhale, everything long. Exhale, crunch. Inhale, lengthen. So you just keep moving with your breath for as long as you can. Home practitioners, maybe you're watching this and you're wondering, I don't have a yoga block, so can I not do this? There are a billion different things you can use instead of a yoga block. Let me show you a couple. You don't have any of those? You can use a water bottle, you can use a can of paint, you can use a jar of tomatoes or a can of tomatoes. There are so many different things laying around your house that you can use. It doesn't have to be a yoga block. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found the video useful, and I hope you start using yoga blocks in your practice. I will see you next time.